In the city of Chicago, there were names that people whispered in the dark to keep the monsters at bay, and then there was the name Dante the Ghost Ricci, a name that made even the monsters bolt their doors. He was a phantom of absolute control, a man who had successfully stripped away the messy, unpredictable layers of human emotion to become a surgical instrument of pure, unadulterated power. For over a decade, Dante had ruled the city's underworld with a silence that was more terrifying than any scream, a ghost who moved through the shadows of high-stakes business and brutal enforcement without ever leaving a trace of his own humanity behind. He believed in one fundamental truth: sentiment was a fatal weakness, a seam in the armor that would eventually let in the blade that killed you. Tonight, as he sat in his usual corner at the Velvet Crown, surrounded by the heavy mahogany and the hushed whispers of men in $1,000 suits, Dante Ricci was the absolute master of his domain. A king of shadows who felt nothing but the cold weight of his own authority. His presence alone was enough to dictate the temperature of the room. Waiters moved with practiced invisibility, never meeting his steel-gray eyes, and even his most trusted lieutenants, like the rugged and silent Rocco, understood that the silence around Dante was sacred. This was the inner sanctum of the Ricci Empire, a place where numbers were discussed with surgical precision and territories were divided like a map on a surgeon's table. Dante sat with a calculated stillness, his hands, the hands that had built an empire stretching across 3 states, resting precisely on the white linen of the table. He was 36 years old, a man at the peak of his power, a man who had outlived his rivals by simply outcalculating them. He was the ghost of Chicago, a legend built on the premise that he was untouchable because he had nothing left to lose and no heart left to break. The city outside was a chaotic sprawl of noise and light, but inside the restaurant, everything was managed. Every patron understood the unspoken rules: pay your respects, mind your business, and never disrupt the equilibrium of Dante Ricci's world. It was a world of luxury and violence, of premium whiskey and whispered deals that decided the fate of millions. For 10 years, this had been the rhythm of his life, a methodical progression toward total dominance. Dante took a slow sip of his drink, his sharp gaze scanning the room, seeing not people, but assets and obstacles. He had purged the man he used to be, the man who had known Sarah, leaving only the legend, the cold, clinical architect of the Chicago underworld. Dante's mind drifted momentarily to the sheer scale of the empire he had constructed. From the shipping docks on the south side to the high-rise financial districts in the Loop, his influence was like a subterranean root system, invisible yet vital to the city's dark economy. He remembered the early days, the blood-soaked alleyways, and the desperate gambles of a younger man who hadn't yet learned to freeze his heart. He had survived those years by realizing that every man had a price or a pressure point, and by ensuring that he had neither. By the time he had claimed the title of the Ghost, he had successfully alienated everyone who could be used against him. He was a man with no family, no lovers, and no friends, only subordinates and subjects. This isolation was his greatest strength, the fortress that made him immune to the betrayals that felled his predecessors. The Velvet Crown was the physical manifestation of this fortress. Every Tuesday night, the restaurant was closed to the public, reserved for the men who kept the city running in the dark. The air was thick with the scent of aged cedar and expensive tobacco, a sensory profile that Dante associated with the quiet exercise of absolute power. He watched as Rocco leaned in to whisper a report about a minor skirmish in the Northern Territory, his face a mask of professional neutrality. Dante processed the information in seconds, his mind sorting through the potential outcomes and selecting the most efficient, least emotional solution. "Neutralize the leadership," he said, his voice a low, raspy velvet that vibrated with a sudden, heavy weight. "But do it quietly. I don't want the noise to disrupt the business." This was the life of the Ghost, a series of calculated decisions made in the cold comfort of a luxury tomb. He had achieved everything he set out to accomplish, yet as he looked around the room at the men who feared him, he felt a strange, hollow echo in the center of his being. It wasn't regret. He didn't believe in the luxury of regret. It was more of a clinical observation, a recognition that he had become so efficient at being a phantom that he was starting to forget what it felt like to be solid. But then, the problem with ghosts is that they are always haunted by the things they left behind. Even as Dante presided over his weekly meeting, the foundation of his silent empire was beginning to tremor from a force he couldn't calculate. The heavy oak doors of the Velvet Crown were designed to keep the world out, but they weren't designed to stop the desperate instinct of a child who had nowhere else to turn. When those doors burst open with a force that sent a shockwave through the room, the silence didn't just break, it shattered. Every head turned, and for the first time in 10 years, Dante Ricci found himself looking at something that didn't fit into his spreadsheets or his strategies. He saw a little girl, barely 6 years old, standing in the doorway like a small, broken bird in a cage of wolves. She was a vision of raw, unfiltered desperation that stood in violent contrast to the polished elegance of the room. Her thin nightgown was torn and stained with blood, not her own, and her bare feet were red from the biting cold of the Chicago streets. The room held its collective breath, the clinking of glasses and the low murmurs of business dying instantly. The manager rushed forward, his face pale with panic, but he was too late to intercept the intruder. Penny's eyes, wide with a child's instinct for power, swept the room desperately. She ignored the bodyguards and the wealthy patrons who looked away in discomfort. Her gaze landed on the one man in the room who didn't look away, the one man whose mere presence commanded both respect and terror. She saw the steel-gray eyes of Dante Ricci, and she ran toward him. The bodyguards tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward their jackets, ready to neutralize the threat to their leader. This was an unprecedented breach of protocol, a direct challenge to the untouchable status of the ghost. But Dante remained perfectly still, a statue of dark silk and iron will, as the little girl reached his table and grabbed his sleeve with both hands. Her tiny, trembling fingers clutched the expensive fabric, as if it were the only lifeline left in a world that had tried to drown her. The blood on her hands, Sarah's blood, transferred to his sleeve, a dark, jagged stain on his perfect armor. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where the power of the ghost met the raw vulnerability of a child. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed on Dante, waiting for the cold, calculated reaction that would restore the order of his world. They expected him to push her away, to call for Rocco to remove the distraction, to maintain the facade of the man who felt nothing. But then Penny spoke, her voice breaking the heavy stillness with a plea that would echo in Dante's mind for the rest of his life. "They're beating my mom," she sobbed, her voice a fragile thread of hope in the darkness. "She's the only one I have left. Please, please save Sarah." In that moment, the ghost of Chicago died, and the man who had once loved a woman named Sarah was forced to face the wreckage of the life he had tried to leave behind. Dante looked down at the stain on his sleeve, the red bloom of Sarah's pain spreading across the expensive wool. He could feel the eyes of his lieutenants on him, the unspoken questions hanging in the air like smoke. His reputation as the Reaper, the cold-blooded master of Chicago, was on the line. But the name Sarah had acted like a skeleton key, unlocking a vault he had spent a decade welding shut. He remembered the way she used to look at him before he became a monster, the way she had begged him to choose a different path. He had chosen the shadows to protect her, but now the shadows had found her anyway. The realization that his own empire was likely the cause of her suffering brought a cold, sharp clarity to his mind. He didn't pull his arm away. Instead, he looked at Rocco, his eyes burning with a light that hadn't been seen in the Velvet Crown since its inception. The lieutenants saw the change, the subtle shift in his posture that signaled the end of the meeting and the beginning of a war. "Get the car," Dante said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the mahogany walls seem to tremble. And Rocco, bring everyone. The ghost was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a man with a heart that had just been forcibly restarted. As he stood up, the little girl still clinging to his arm, the people in the velvet crown realized they were witnessing the birth of a new legend, one written in blood and fueled by a love that even death couldn't erase. Dante Ricci stared at the child, his world narrowing down to the tiny, trembling hands clutching his sleeve. The VIP room of the Velvet Crown, usually a bastion of ironclad silence and calculated indifference, had transformed into a theater of the surreal. The men surrounding him, hardened killers, high-level fixers, and stone-faced lieutenants, shifted in their seats, their discomfort palpable in the dim, amber light. They were looking for the ghost, the man who had ordered executions over dessert and divided city blocks like a child sharing a candy bar. Instead, they were witnessing the impossible. Dante Ricci was hesitant. His steel-gray eyes, which had seen more blood than most surgeons, were anchored to Penny's face. He wasn't looking at a street urchin or an intruder. He was looking at a living, breathing ghost from a decade ago. The curve of her jaw, the specific, defiant arch of her brow, and the deep, soulful brown of her eyes were a genetic map leading straight back to the one person he had tried to erase from his existence. Penny, he whispered, the name feeling like gravel in a throat and used to speaking with anything other than command. The girl's sobbing hitched. She looked up at him, her face a mask of grime, tears, and a desperate hope that pierced through Dante's decade-old armor. She didn't know who he was to the city. She only saw a man who looked like he could stop the monsters. "You know my name?" she asked, her voice a small, fragile thing. Dante didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was a chaotic storm of memories he had suppressed with the efficiency of a censor. He saw Sarah, not the Sarah who was currently being beaten in some godforsaken warehouse, but the Sarah of 10 years ago. He remembered the smell of rain on her skin and the way she had looked at him the night he told her he was leaving. He had told her it was to protect her, that his world was too dark for her light. He had believed that by disappearing, he was giving her a life. Instead, it seemed he had only left her defenseless against the very world he had helped build. Rocco cleared his throat, the sound sharp and intrusive. "Boss?" "The room. People are starting to talk." Dante's gaze snapped up. The ghost returned, but with a new jagged edge. The cold calculation was there, but it was fueled by a primal, protective instinct he hadn't felt in an eternity. He looked at the blood on his sleeve, Sarah's blood, carried to him by her child. It wasn't just a stain, it was a summons. "Everyone out," Dante commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. "Dante, we were in the middle of the North Side distribution." One of the lieutenants started to protest, his voice trailing off as Dante's eyes locked onto his. "I set out," Dante repeated. The room emptied in a flurry of hushed movements and scraping chairs. The powerful men of Chicago fled from a child and the look in their leader's eyes. Only Rocco remained, standing like a sentinel by the door. Dante turned back to Penny. He reached out, his long, scarred fingers trembling slightly as he brushed a matted lock of hair from her forehead. He saw the bruises on her small arms, the marks of a struggle she should never have been part of. "How long, Penny?" Dante asked. "How long has it been since they took her?" "A long time," Penny whimpered, her energy fading as the adrenaline of her flight began to wear off. "The men with the black masks, they came to the apartment. They said she owed them for you. They said your name, Mr. Ghost." Dante's jaw tightened until it ached. "Owed them for me?" He realized then that his anonymity, his greatest weapon, had been compromised. Someone had spent 10 years digging, looking for the one thing the ghost still cared about. They hadn't found a business rival or a hidden account, they had found Sarah. And because Sarah had been too proud or too afraid to ever reach out to him, she had been living a life of quiet vulnerability while he built a throne of bones. "Rocco," Dante said, not looking away from Penny. "I'm already on it, boss." Rocco replied, his phone already out. Tracing the black van reports from the 4th district. If they used his name, it's a message. They want you to know they have her. Dante stood up, lifting Penny as if she weighed nothing. She buried her head in his shoulder, her small hands clutching the lapels of his suit. The ghost, who never touched anyone, who lived in a vacuum of his own making, was now carrying a child through the most expensive restaurant in the city. As he walked toward the exit, the patrons of the Velvet Crown watched in a silence so thick it felt like physical pressure. They were seeing a legend crumble and something far more terrifying take its place, a man with a purpose beyond profit. Sarah, Dante whispered into the child's hair, a vow and a prayer all in one. He had spent a decade building a city that feared him. Now he was going to burn it to the ground to find the woman he had never stopped loving. The features of the girl in his arms were the only map he needed to know that the child wasn't just Sarah's, she was his. 10 years of silence had been a lie. Sarah had been protecting him from his own heart just as much as he had been trying to protect her from his world. The ghost was dead. The man had returned, and he was bringing hell with him. Dante stepped out into the freezing Chicago night, the sirens in the distance sounding like an orchestra for the war that was about to begin. He didn't care about the territories, the numbers, or the business deals. He only cared about the woman who had given him a daughter he never knew he had, and the men who were foolish enough to think they could survive his wrath. "Hold on, Penny," Dante said as Rocco pulled the armored SUV around. "We're going to get your mom." The door closed with a heavy thud, sealing the city's fate. The ghost had found his heart, and he was going to make sure everyone who stood in his way felt it beating right before he stopped theirs. Dante settled into the leather seat of the SUV, Penny still anchored to his chest. Her small breaths were shallow, her exhaustion finally winning over her terror. He looked down at the bloodstain on his sleeve, Sarah's blood, and felt a physical pull toward the south side, toward the darkness where he knew his past was being tortured for his present. "Status, Rocco," Dante barked, the sound sharp in the enclosed space. Rocco adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Dante's with a grim understanding. Traffic cams caught a black Ford Transit leaving Sarah's block 20 minutes ago. "It's heading toward the old shipyard." "That's Moretti territory, Dante. If they're involved, this is a coup disguised as a kidnapping." "Moretti," Dante spat. The name was a relic of an older generation, a family he had let survive because they were useful as a buffer. If they had laid a hand on Sarah, that utility was over. "Call the Vanguard. Tell them I want every Moretti warehouse under surveillance. If they so much as sneeze, I want to hear about it." "And the girl?" Rocco asked, glancing back at Penny. Dante looked at his daughter, the daughter he was only just beginning to realize was his. The math was simple, the timing perfect, and the face was undeniable. "She stays with me. She's the only one who can tell us what they saw." As the vehicle sped through the rain-slicked streets, Dante found himself wandering through the corridors of his own mind, revisiting the night he left. He had stood on Sarah's doorstep, the weight of a pistol in his waistband and a $1,000 contract in his pocket. He had told her he was moving away for a job, something corporate, something safe. He had lied to her to save her, believing that if she didn't know the monster he was becoming, the monster could never find her. He was wrong. The monster hadn't found her because of what he was. It had found her because of who he had become. His success, his absolute control, had made him a target, and in the underworld, if you can't hit the king, you hit what the king used to be. "We're 10 minutes out," Rocco reported, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. Dante tightened his grip on Penny. The silence of the city outside seemed to mock him. He had built this city on silence, and now that silence was screaming Sarah's name. Every street lamp, every shadow, felt like an accusation. He had been the ghost for so long he had forgotten that ghosts are tethered to the living. "Rocco," Dante said, his voice cold as the Chicago wind. "When we get there, I don't want prisoners. I want names. I want to know who told them about her. And then I want to watch their world end. Rocco nodded. He had seen Dante Ricci kill, but he had never seen him hunt. This wasn't business. This was a man reclaiming a soul he had tried to throw away. The SUV screeched toward the industrial district, the skeletal remains of the shipyards rising out of the fog like the ribs of a giant. Somewhere in that maze of steel and rust, Sarah was waiting. And Dante Ricci, the man they called the Ghost, was coming to show the world that even a phantom could bleed, and that when he did, the whole world would drown in it. He looked down at Penny one last time before the violence began. She was the innocence he had lost, the hope he had discarded. He wouldn't lose her again. Not tonight. Not ever. Find them, Dante whispered, his steel-gray eyes glowing with a lethal, resurrected fire. Find them all. The black armored SUV cut through the thick Chicago fog like a predatory shark through murky waters. Inside, the atmosphere was pressurized, heavy with the unsaid. Dante, the Ghost, Ricci sat in the rear, his frame rigid, his eyes never leaving the small, sleeping form of Penny. She had finally succumbed to the weight of her trauma, her head resting against the cold leather of the seat, her breathing hitching occasionally in a lingering sob. Dante looked at his hands. They were clean, manicured, and steady, the hands of a man who moved pieces on a board. But on his sleeve, the dark, dried stain of Sarah's blood remained. It was a visceral reminder that the board had been flipped. The Ghost was no longer playing a game of influence. He was being pulled back into the world of grit, iron, and bone. Rocco, Dante's voice was a low vibration, barely audible over the hum of the high-performance engine. Tell me about Warehouse 14. Rocco, gripping the steering wheel with hands that looked like they were carved from granite, didn't turn around. It's an old cold storage facility, boss. Abandoned since the late 90s. Technically, it's neutral ground, but the Morettas have been using the surrounding piers to move ghost freight, unmarked crates, no manifests. If they took her there, they aren't planning on keeping her long. It's a transit point. Dante's jaw tightened. A transit point meant Sarah was a commodity. To the Morettas, she wasn't a woman or a mother, she was a lever. They were using her to see if the Ghost still had a heart, and if he did, they intended to cut it out. They think I'm soft, Dante whispered, more to himself than to Rocco. They think 10 years of silk suits and fine dining has turned my blood to wine. They're about to find out the wine is still vinegar, Dante, Rocco replied grimly. The vehicle veered off the main highway, descending into the skeletal remains of the industrial docklands. Here, the streetlights were few and far between, flickering like dying stars. The air tasted of salt, rust, and rot. This was the part of Chicago that the postcards ignored, the graveyard of the city's ambitions. As they approached the perimeter of the shipyard, Dante reached into the hidden compartment beneath the armrest. He pulled out a customized .45 caliber semi-automatic, its matte black finish absorbing the dim light. He checked the magazine with a practiced, rhythmic click. This weapon hadn't seen the light of day in 3 years. He had hoped it never would again. Pull over 3 blocks out, Dante commanded. I'm going in on foot. You stay with the girl. If anyone comes near this car, you don't ask for ID. You bury them. Dante, let me go with you, Rocco protested, his eyes flashing in the rearview mirror. We don't know how many men Moretti has stationed inside. Warehouse 14 is a fortress. No, Dante said, his voice absolute. If I go in with a squad, they'll kill her before I reach the door. They want the Ghost? I'll give them a haunting they'll never forget. He looked down at Penny one last time. She looked so small, so remarkably like Sarah that it made his chest ache with a phantom pain. He realized then that he wasn't just fighting for Sarah's life. He was fighting for the possibility of a version of himself that wasn't a monster. If Sarah died tonight, the Ghost would be all that was left, and he would spend the rest of his days haunting a city of ash. Dante stepped out of the SUV into the biting wind. The cold didn't bother him. He had been cold for a decade. He moved through the shadows with the eerie, fluid grace that had earned him his moniker. He was a shadow among shadows, a whisper in the gale. Warehouse 14 loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the gray sky. The windows were boarded up, save for a few on the upper floor where a flickering orange glow suggested a barrel fire or a portable heater. Two men stood guard by the loading dock, their shoulders hunched against the cold, cigarettes glowing like angry embers in the dark. They were talking, laughing, relaxed. They had no idea that death was currently standing 20 feet away in the darkness. Dante didn't use his gun. Not yet. A gunshot was a herald, and he wanted to be a surprise. He pulled a serrated combat knife from a sheath at the small of his back. He waited for the wind to howl, masking the sound of his footsteps. He was on the first guard before the man could even exhale his smoke. A hand over the mouth, a swift, surgical strike to the carotid, and the man was down, his life leaking into the dirty snow without a sound. The second guard turned, eyes widening, reaching for a pistol tucked into his waistband, but Dante was already there. A heavy boot to the kneecap sent the man reeling, and a blunt strike to the temple with the hilt of the knife silenced him instantly. Dante dragged the bodies into the shadows behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. He stood for a moment, his breathing perfectly regulated, his heart beating with a cold, rhythmic thrum. The adrenaline was there, but it was controlled, channeled into a singular focus. He found a side entrance, a heavy steel door with a rusted latch. It was locked from the inside, but the hinges were ancient. Dante applied a small strip of plastic explosive to the hinge pins, muffled by a thick layer of industrial tape. Thump. The door groaned and gave way. Dante slipped inside. The interior of the warehouse was a cavern of echoing silence and stagnant air. Rows of empty metal shelving stretched into the darkness like the ribs of a dead beast. The only light came from the far end of the floor, where a small office stood elevated on a mezzanine. He could hear voices now. Harsh, grating voices. "She ain't talking, boss." "I told you, she's a tough one." "She'll talk," a second voice replied, a voice Dante recognized as Marco Moretti, the youngest and most volatile of the Moretti brothers. "Everyone talks eventually. If she doesn't tell us where the ghost keeps his private ledgers, maybe the kid will." Dante's vision blurred red for a split second. The mention of Penny was a catalyst, a chemical reaction that turned his cold rage into a searing white heat. He began to climb the metal stairs to the mezzanine, his movement silent, his presence non-existent. As he reached the top, he saw them through the smeared glass of the office window. Sarah was tied to a wooden chair in the center of the room. Her face was bruised, her lips split, but her eyes, those defiant, beautiful eyes, were fixed on Marco with a look of pure loathing. "Dante is going to kill you," Sarah said, her voice raspy but steady. "He won't just kill you. He'll erase you." Marco laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound. He paced the small room, a heavy blackjack in his hand. "The ghost? Please. The ghost is a myth. He's a guy in a suit who forgot how to bleed. He's probably at the Velvet Crown right now, crying into his cognac because a kid got blood on his sleeve." Dante stepped into the light of the doorway. "The cognac was actually quite good, Marco," Dante said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "But the company left something to be desired." The three men in the room froze. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The sheer impossibility of Dante's presence, alone, unheralded, and seemingly out of thin air, stunned them into paralysis. Marco was the first to react, reaching for the Beretta on the desk. Dante didn't hesitate. He fired twice. The first bullet took the guard to Marco's left in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second bullet shattered the desk lamp, plunging the room into chaotic, flickering shadows. Dante moved. He was a whirlwind of violence in the cramped office. He disarmed the second guard with a brutal wrist lock, using the man's own momentum to hurl him through the glass window onto the warehouse floor below. Marco scrambled backward, his hands up, his bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. "Wait. Dante." It was a business move. Just business. Dante ignored him. He stepped toward Sarah. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of terror and an overwhelming, heartbreaking relief. Dante, she whispered. I'm here, Sarah, he said, his voice softening for the first time. He reached out to cut her bonds, but his eyes never left Marco. You touched her, Dante said, turning back to the cowering Moretti. You brought a child into this. You broke the only rule that matters. I'll give her back. I'll leave the city. Dante didn't let him finish. He stepped forward and delivered a single, crushing blow to Marco's jaw, sending him spiraling into unconsciousness. He turned back to Sarah, slicing through the ropes with his knife. As the restraints fell away, she collapsed into his arms. She was shaking, her skin cold and clammy. Dante held her tight, his nose buried in her hair, smelling the faint, lingering scent of the lavender soap she had used 10 years ago. Penny, she gasped. Is she? She's safe. She's with Rocco, Dante assured her. She found me, Sarah. She brought me back. Sarah looked up at him, her fingers tracing the bloodstain on his sleeve. I never wanted this for her, Dante. I never wanted her to see what you are. Dante looked around the room, the violence, the shadows, the broken men. He looked at the gun in his hand and the monster in the mirror of the office window. I know, Dante said, his voice heavy with the weight of a decade of sins. But I'm the only monster who can get you home. He picked her up, her head resting against the same shoulder where Penny had slept only an hour before. As he carried her out of the warehouse, leaving the wreckage of the Moretti's ambition behind him, Dante knew that the war was far from over. The Morettis would seek vengeance, and the city would demand its pound of flesh. But as he stepped back out into the Chicago night, the fog seemed to lift. For the first time in 10 years, the ghost felt the sun beginning to rise in his chest. He wasn't just a phantom anymore. He was a father. He was a protector. And he was going to make sure that anyone who tried to dim that light again would find out exactly why they called him the ghost. Because by the time you saw him coming, you were already dead. Dante reached the SUV, where Rocco was standing guard, his rifle slung low. Rocco took one look at Sarah and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the victory. Get her inside, Dante commanded. We're going to the safe house. And Rocco, yeah, boss. Call the cleaners. I want warehouse 14 leveled. I don't want a single brick left standing to remind me of what almost happened tonight. Consider it done. As the SUV sped away from the docks, Dante sat between the two women he loved, his hands finally beginning to shake. The ghost was gone. Dante Ricci was home. The safe house was a brutalist slab of concrete and reinforced steel tucked away in a forgotten pocket of the West Loop, hidden behind the facade of a failing textile factory. Inside, however, it was a high-tech fortress. The air was sterile, filtered by industrial systems that hummed with a low, constant thrum, providing a rhythmic backdrop to the tension that saturated the room. Dante, the ghost, Ricci stood by the floor-to-ceiling reinforced window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. From this height, the city looked like a circuit board, electric, interconnected, and cold. He still wore the suit from the Velvet Crown, though he had discarded the jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. The bloodstain on his cuff had dried to a dull, haunting rust color. Behind him, on a deep leather sofa, Sarah was finally asleep. A private physician, one of the few people in the city who knew how to stitch a wound without asking a single question, had finished tending to her bruises and the deep lacerations on her wrists. Beside her, Penny was curled into a ball, her small hand clutching the hem of her mother's sweater even in sleep. The sight of them together made Dante's chest feel like it was being constricted by iron bands. He had spent 10 years convincing himself that isolation was his greatest weapon. He had built an empire on the premise that he was a man with no handles, nothing for an enemy to grab onto. Now, in a single night, The two biggest handles in the world were lying 10 feet away from him. Rocco entered the room, his footsteps heavy on the polished concrete. He held two phones and a tablet that flickered with constant data streams. He stopped a respectful distance from Dante, his face grim. "The warehouse is gone, Dante," Rocco reported, his voice a low rumble. "The cleaners did their job. By sunrise, there won't even be a scorched mark on the pavement. But the city is waking up. The Moretti family isn't just going to take this. You didn't just rescue a woman, you crippled Marco. Old man Moretti is going to see this as an act of war." Dante didn't turn around. "It is an act of war, Rocco. They broke the unspoken code. They went after a civilian. They went after a child. They didn't know she was yours," Rocco countered softly. "Nobody did. They thought she was just a lever. Now that they know she's your daughter, the stakes have shifted. You're not the ghost anymore to them. You're a father. And in our world, a father is someone who can be negotiated with." Dante turned then, his eyes flashing with a predatory light that made even Rocco take a half step back. "I am not negotiating. I want the Moretti line ended. Every captain, every soldier, every shell company. I want them erased from the map of this city." Rocco nodded, but his expression remained cautious. "That kind of move takes time. And right now, time is the one thing we don't have. We have Sarah and Penny in a safe house, but for how long? The Morettis have moles in the PD, in the docks, maybe even in our own logistics. We need to move them." "No," Dante said, his voice absolute. "This safe house is the most secure location in the state. We move them, we risk an intercept. We stay here, we fortify, and we bring the war to Moretti's doorstep." Dante walked over to the sofa, looking down at the two people who had effectively ended his life as a phantom. Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were bloodshot and filled with a lingering shadow of the warehouse, but when they landed on Dante, they sharpened. "Penny," she whispered, her voice still raspy from the screaming she had done earlier that night. "She's safe, Sarah." "She hasn't moved since we got here," Dante said, sitting on the edge of the low table across from her. Sarah sat up slowly, wincing as she moved her bruised ribs. She looked around the sterile, cold environment of the safe house, the monitors, the weapon racks in the corner, the armored doors. "This is your world, isn't it? This is where the ghost lives." "It's where I survived," Dante replied. "I tried so hard to keep her away from this," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and exhaustion. 10 years, Dante. I worked 3 jobs, I moved 3 times, I changed our last name. I did everything right. And yet, here she is, sleeping on a couch in a fortress because her father is a ghost. Dante felt the sting of her words, a sharp contrast to the physical violence he had dealt with earlier. "I thought my absence was her protection. I believed that if I stayed away, the shadow wouldn't fall on you." "The shadow follows the man, Dante. It always has," Sarah said. She looked at Penny, then back at him. "What happens now? We can't stay here forever. She needs a school. She needs a life. She needs to not be afraid of every black van that drives past." Dante stood up, paced the length of the room, and then turned back to her. "The Morettis think they found a weakness. They think they can use you to extract concessions, to take over the docks, to bleed me dry. I'm going to show them that they haven't found a weakness. They found a reason for me to stop holding back." He looked at Rocco. "Call the Vanguard. I want a full-scale blackout on all Moretti assets. Start with their offshore accounts. I want them penniless by noon. Then, send the strike teams to their distribution hubs. No survivors." "Dante," Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. "You're talking about a massacre. That's not going to make us safe. That's just going to make the target on our backs bigger. In this city, Sarah, the only way to be safe is to be the only one left standing," Dante said, his voice turning back into the cold, clinical tone of the ghost. "I didn't build this empire by playing defense. I built it by being the thing that people are afraid of in the dark." The room fell into a heavy silence, interrupted only by the sound of Penny shifting in her sleep. For the first time, Dante felt the impossible weight of his dual identity. He was the man who wanted to hold his daughter and tell her everything would be okay, and he was the monster who had to go out into the night and kill 50 men to ensure that promise wasn't a lie. Rocco's phone chirped, a sharp, insistent sound. He looked at the screen, his face draining of color. "Boss, we have a problem." Dante crossed the room in 3 strides. "What?" "It's not just the Morettas. Word traveled fast about the warehouse. The commission, the heads of the other 4 families, they're calling an emergency session. They're saying you broke the peace. They're saying that by bringing your personal life into a territorial dispute, you've made yourself a liability." Dante laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "A liability? I am the only reason the city's economy hasn't collapsed into a street war. I move their money, I secure their routes, and I keep the feds off their backs." "They don't care," Rocco said. "They see a crack in the ghost's armor. And in our world, a crack is an invitation. They've put out a summons. They want you at the high table tonight. Unarmed. Alone." Sarah looked at Dante, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't go. It's a trap. You know it's a trap." "Of course it's a trap," Dante said, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as he calculated the moves. "But if I don't go, they'll see it as a confirmation of my weakness. They'll all join the Morettas. I'll be fighting the whole city at once." He looked at Penny, who was still soundly asleep, her face finally peaceful. He realized then that the ghost had one last job to do. He had to go into the heart of the enemy, into a room filled with the most dangerous men in the country, and he had to convince them that he was still the monster they feared. "Rocco, prepare the car. And I want the secondary security team activated here. If I don't check in every 30 minutes, you take Sarah and Penny to the airfield. Use the silver protocol. Don't stop for anything." "Dante, no," Sarah said, standing up despite her pain. She walked to him, her hands trembling as she grabbed his forearms. "You just got us back. You can't leave now." Dante looked down at her. For a moment, the ghost vanished. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers. "I'm doing this so you never have to run again, Sarah. I'm going to end this tonight." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, silver locket Penny had dropped. He pressed it into Sarah's hand. "Keep this. And keep her close." As Dante walked toward the door, he stopped by the weapon rack. He didn't grab a gun, he couldn't take one to the high table. Instead, he grabbed a small, inconspicuous pen from a drawer, a tactical tool made of high-grade titanium. He tucked it into his shirt pocket, rolled his sleeves back down, and donned his charcoal-gray jacket. He looked in the mirror. The man looking back was the ghost, cold, lethal, and perfectly composed. But as he looked at the bloodstain on his cuff, he felt a flicker of the man he used to be. "Rocco," Dante said as they stepped into the elevator. "If this goes south, make sure they never find them." "I'll give my life for them, Dante. You know that." "I know," Dante said as the elevator doors closed, plunging them into the descent toward the city. "But tonight, I'm planning on everyone else giving theirs." The SUV pulled out of the factory gates, disappearing into the pre-dawn fog. Dante sat in the back, his eyes closed, mentally rehearsing the names of the men he was about to face. He wasn't going to the high table to negotiate. He was going there to remind them why he was the only one they called a ghost. Because you can't kill what is already dead inside, and tonight, Dante Ricci was the deadliest thing in Chicago. The high table was not a literal piece of furniture, but a concept, a convergence of the city's most depraved architects of power. It met in the sub-basement of the old exchange, a pre-war stone monolith that sat in the heart of the financial district. To the world above, it was a historical landmark. To the world below, it was the throat of Chicago, where the city's oxygen was metered out to those who could pay the price in blood and coin. As Dante, the ghost, Ricci stepped out of the elevator and into the dimly lit corridor of the sub-basement, he felt the familiar pressure of the deep. The walls were lined with damp limestone, and the air smelled of wet earth and cold ozone. At the end of the hallway stood two massive bronze doors, guarded by four men who looked more like statues than humans, augmented, scarred, and completely indifferent to the status of the man walking toward them. Dante stopped 10 feet from the doors. He raised his arms slowly, allowing the guards to perform the mandatory sweep. Their hands were rough, checking his waistband, his ankles, and the lining of his charcoal jacket with a clinical, invasive efficiency. They found the titanium pen in his pocket, turning it over in the light. "It's a writing utensil," Dante said, his voice a flat, dead calm. "I assume we're still keeping minutes of our meetings." The guard grunted and slid the pen back into Dante's pocket. He didn't find the razor-thin wire hidden in the hem of Dante's silk tie, nor the ceramic blade embedded in the sole of his left shoe. The ghost never went truly unarmed. He simply carried tools that the world hadn't yet categorized as weapons. The bronze doors groaned open, revealing a chamber that looked like a cross between a boardroom and a dungeon. A circular table of black obsidian sat in the center, lit by a single, massive chandelier of wrought iron and flickering candles. Around the table sat the four men who, along with Dante, controlled every illegal breath taken in the Midwest. There was Silvio Moretti, the patriarch, a man who looked like a withered grape but possessed the venom of a cobra. Beside him sat Viktor Volkov, the Russian head of the labor unions, Sloan, the Irishman who controlled the port of entry, and Councilman Sterling, the legitimate face of the group who ensured the law looked the other way. Dante walked to the empty fifth chair. He didn't sit. He stood with his hands resting on the back of the obsidian seat, his steel-gray eyes moving slowly from face to face. "You called," Dante said. "And yet, nobody has offered me a drink. My hospitality at the Velvet Crown is clearly superior." "Hospitality died the moment you leveled a warehouse in the north side, Ricci," Silvio Moretti rasped. His voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "You broke the peace. You attacked my son. You spilled blood on neutral ground." "I responded to a breach of the covenant," Dante countered, his voice rising just enough to command the room. "The covenant states that civilians and families are off limits. Your son snatched a woman and a child from their home. He brought the ghost to his doorstep. If anything, Silvio, you should be thanking me for not ending your entire bloodline before dessert." Volkov leaned forward, the light reflecting off the silver caps on his teeth. "The child, Ricci. That is the point of interest. The whispers say she called you father. The whispers say the ghost has a pulse after all." Dante felt the titanium pen in his pocket. He wanted to drive it through Volkov's eye, but he kept his expression as cold and unreadable as the obsidian table. "The whispers are a distraction. The reality is that the Morettis attempted to use a personal connection to bypass my authority over the docks. If I allow that to stand, the balance of this table is gone. Today it's my past, tomorrow it's yours, Sloan. Or your daughter's, Councilman." Sterling, the politician, adjusted his glasses. "The optics are poor, Dante. We rely on your ghost persona because it represents a machine. A machine doesn't have a daughter. A machine doesn't burn down $1 million of real estate because of a grudge. You've become emotional. And emotion is expensive." "Expensive?" Dante laughed, a sound so hollow it seemed to chill the flickering candles. "I have made more money for this table in the last 3 years than the four of you combined in the last decade. I am the machine that launders your conscience. If you think my emotions are a liability, try running your empires without my shadow to hide in." The room grew thick with a predatory silence. This was the moment of the summons, the test to see if the king was still fit for the throne. Silvio Moretti stood up, his trembling hands leaning on a cane topped with a silver wolf's head. "The commission has reached a consensus, Dante. We cannot have a leader who is compromised by a family he kept hidden. It makes us look weak to the families in New York. It makes us vulnerable to the feds." "And what is the consensus, Silvio?" Dante asked, his muscles coiling like a spring. "You give us the girl," Silvio said, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. She will be raised as a ward of the commission. A guarantee of your future loyalty. You return to being the ghost, and we forget the warehouse. Sarah, the mother. She is a loose end. We will handle her quietly. Dante felt the air in the room turn to ice. The proposal wasn't just an insult. It was a death warrant for the man he was trying to become. They wanted to take Penny, his blood, his second chance, and turn her into a hostage. They wanted to murder Sarah, the only light he had ever known. I have a counter-proposal, Dante said, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed off the damp limestone walls. Oh, Sloane asked, his hand drifting toward the weapon he had surely smuggled in. And what's that? Dante leaned forward, his hands flat on the obsidian table. I'm going to walk out of these doors. I'm going to go back to my safe house. And if any of you, or anyone you employ, so much as thinks the name Penny or Sarah again, I will not just kill you. I will dismantle everything you have built. I will give the feds your ledgers. I will give your rivals your coordinates. I will turn this city into a graveyard and bury the four of you in a single trench. Silvio Moretti chuckled, but it was a nervous, jagged sound. You're alone, Dante. You're unarmed in a room surrounded by 50 of our best men. You aren't walking out of anywhere. Am I? Dante asked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the titanium pen. Volkov laughed. What are you going to do, Ricci? Write us a stern letter. Dante clicked the top of the pen. Instead of a nib, a small, blinking red LED appeared. This isn't a pen. It's a dead man switch. It synced to a series of thermite charges I had Rocco plant in the structural supports of this building 20 minutes ago. If I stop pressing this button, or if my heart rate exceeds 140 beats per minute, this entire sub-basement becomes a furnace. We all go into the dirt together. The laughter died instantly. Sterling's face turned the color of ash. Volkov's hand froze halfway to his jacket. You're bluffing, Silvio hissed, though his eyes were darting toward the ceiling. You wouldn't kill yourself. Not now that you have something to live for. That's where you're wrong, Silvio, Dante said, his steel-gray eyes boring into the old man's soul. Having something to live for makes me more dangerous, not less. Because it means I have something worth dying for. And if I have to die to make sure you never touch them, I'll do it with a smile on my face. Dante began to back away toward the bronze doors, his thumb pressed firmly on the top of the pen. The four men at the table watched him, paralyzed by the realization that the ghost had indeed been replaced by something far more volatile. The deal is this, Dante said as he reached the doors. I'm taking my family, and I'm leaving the Ricci organization. You get the territories. You get the routes. You get the money. But you never, ever look for us. If I see a single eye in my rearview mirror, the ledgers go to the U.S. attorney, and the thermite goes off in your homes. Do we have an agreement? The silence stretched for an eternity. Finally, Sterling nodded. Take it. Take them and go. Just get that thing out of here. Dante didn't wait for a second confirmation. He stepped out of the room, the bronze doors heavy as they slammed shut behind him. He didn't run. He walked with a measured, lethal calm back toward the elevator. As the doors closed and he began the ascent to the surface, he didn't let go of the pen. He knew the commission. They wouldn't honor the deal, not forever. They would wait until he was soft, until he was domestic and distracted. They thought they were letting a tiger go back to the jungle, but Dante knew the truth. He was the jungle. He reached the street level, the cold Chicago air hitting his face like a benediction. Rocco was waiting in the SUV, the engine idling, the headlights cutting through the pre-dawn mist. Did they buy it? Rocco asked as Dante climbed into the back. Dante looked at the titanium pen. He clicked it again, and the LED turned off. They bought it for now. They think it was a bomb. They don't realize it's actually a GPS transmitter that just uploaded the floor plans and security codes of the old exchange to our server. So, what now? Dante looked at the bloodstain on his cuff. He felt the weight of the city he was about to leave behind, the empire he had built on silence and fear. He looked at the seat beside him, imagining Penny and Sarah there, safe and away from the limestone dungeons of his past. Now, Dante said, we go to the safe house. We pack the silver bags. And then, Rocco, we burn the ledgers. The ghost is officially retiring. And if they come for us? Dante looked out at the skyline, the sun finally beginning to bleed over the edge of Lake Michigan, turning the steel towers to gold. Let them come, Dante whispered. I've spent 10 years learning how to be a ghost. It's time I showed them how to be a nightmare. The SUV surged forward, leaving the financial district behind. Dante sat in the back, his hand reaching into his pocket to touch the locket he had taken back from the safe house earlier. He wasn't a king of shadows anymore. He wasn't a surgical instrument of the commission. He was a man going home to his daughter. And as the city blurred past him, Dante Ricci realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the light. The silence in the safe house was no longer the heavy, professional quiet that Dante Ricci had spent a decade cultivating. It was a jagged, glass-edged silence, brittle enough to shatter at the slightest breath. In the center of the main room, a massive digital map of Chicago's 4th District glowed on a wall-mounted monitor, casting a ghostly blue light over Dante's face. He had been standing there for 3 hours, motionless, his eyes tracing the red dot movements of Moretti's remaining assets. Behind him, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Penny was finally asleep in the adjacent room, tucked under a heavy duvet in a bed meant for high-ranking fugitives. You're going to do it, aren't you? Sarah's voice was small, but it cut through the room like a siren. Dante didn't turn around. Do what, Sarah? You're going to break the one rule you used to justify leaving me. You're going loud. You're going to show the whole city that the ghost is just a man with a gun and a grudge. Dante finally turned, his expression a mask of charcoal and steel. The Morettis didn't just break the peace, they attempted to seize my legacy. If I don't respond with overwhelming force, every captain in this city will think it's open season on you and Penny. I don't have the luxury of being a shadow tonight. But if you do this, Sarah stood up, her voice rising with a desperate edge, there's no going back. You can't be a father on the weekends and the Reaper on the weekdays. Penny saw you tonight, Dante. She saw the blood on your sleeve. She saw the look in your eyes when you walked through those restaurant doors. You're scaring her just as much as they did. Dante felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his chest. He looked at his hands, the hands that had built an empire on the premise of being untouchable. I am scaring myself, Sarah. But I would rather her be afraid of me than dead because of them. Rocco entered the room from the communication hub, his face a grim roadmap of the night's casualties. He held a tablet out to Dante. We've got a problem, boss. The commission didn't wait for the morning. They've frozen the Ricci logistics accounts. They're calling it protective custody of our assets until the personal matter is resolved. We're being cut off. Dante took the tablet, his eyes scanning the forensic accounting logs. This was the move he had feared most. The other 4 families weren't just watching, they were vultures circling a wounded predator. By freezing his accounts, they were forcing him to fight the Morettis with whatever he had on hand. They wanted him to bleed out so they could split his territory. The code is dead, Dante whispered, his voice a low, raspy velvet. They think they can starve a ghost. He looked at Rocco. Activate the Cinder protocol. Rocco's eyes widened. Dante, Cinder is for a total collapse. It means burning every bridge we have. No more business, no more treaties, no more ghost. It means we go to war with everyone. Everyone is already at war with us, Rocco. They just haven't realized it yet. Dante walked to the heavy steel locker in the corner of the room. He punched in a complex biometric code, and the doors hissed open, revealing an arsenal that would make a SWAT commander weep. He didn't reach for the subtle, suppressed pistols of his usual trade. He reached for a customized tactical vest and a high-capacity submachine gun. He was shedding the silk suit for the armor of a soldier. Sarah watched him, her eyes filling with tears. This is what you wanted, isn't it? On some level, you missed this. You missed being the monster. Dante stopped, his hand hovering over a magazine pouch. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the ghost vanished, replaced by the man who had loved her 10 years ago. I hated every second of the last 10 years because you weren't there, Sarah. I didn't want this. But I'm good at it. And right now, being good at this is the only thing that keeps you breathing. He turned back to Rocco. I want the Moretti compound in Lake Forest. Not tomorrow. Now. I want every light in that house extinguished. I want Silvio Moretti to see me coming, and I want him to know that the ghost didn't die. He just stopped caring about the rules. Dante, wait. Sarah stepped into his path, her hand reaching out to touch the cold Kevlar of his vest. What about Penny? What do I tell her when she wakes up and you're gone? Dante leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. The scent of her lavender soap, the same one she had used a decade ago, was the only thing anchoring him to his humanity. Tell her I'm going to make the world quiet for her. Tell her that her father is a ghost who protects his own. He pulled away before the sentiment could swallow him. He couldn't afford to be a father for the next 4 hours. He had to be the nightmare that Chicago had forgotten how to fear. As Dante and Rocco headed for the elevator, the safe house felt like a tomb. The blue light of the monitors flickered, reflecting off the steel and concrete. Dante checked his weapon one last time, the mechanical clicks echoing in the narrow space. Rocco, Dante said as the elevator began its descent. Yeah, boss. If I don't make it out of Lake Forest, you take them to the airfield. You use the silver bags. You don't look back. Rocco nodded, his rugged face set in stone. I know the drill, Dante. But you're not dying tonight. You've got too much to live for, and that makes you the most dangerous man in this city. The elevator doors opened into the sub-basement garage. The black SUV was idling, its headlights cutting through the damp, oily air. Dante stepped into the night, the cold Chicago wind hitting him like a benediction. He wasn't a king of shadows anymore. He wasn't the surgical architect of the underworld. He was a man on a mission of absolute destruction. The drive to Lake Forest was a blur of neon lights and rain-slicked pavement. Dante sat in the back, his eyes closed, mentally rehearsing the layout of the Moretti estate. He knew where the guards would be, where the security cameras were blind, and where the old man kept his private safe. He wasn't just going to rescue Sarah's peace of mind. He was going to dismantle the Moretti legacy brick by brick. As they crossed the city limits, the landscape changed from the grid of the docks to the manicured lawns of the ultra-wealthy. This was where the monsters lived in plain sight, behind iron gates and security details. Dante watched the passing mansions, realizing that he had spent his life protecting these people from each other. Tonight, he was the threat they couldn't buy off. Rocco pulled the vehicle onto a dirt shoulder a mile from the Moretti gates. Thermal shows 12 guards on the perimeter, Dante. 6 more inside the main house. Silvio is in the study. He's not sleeping. He's waiting for a phone call. He's waiting for the commission to tell him I'm dead, Dante said, stepping out of the car. He adjusted his gear, the weight of the weapons feeling oddly natural. Let's change the narrative. He moved through the woods with the fluid, silent grace that had earned him his name. The ghost was back, but he was fueled by a white-hot rage that made him faster, sharper, and more lethal than he had ever been. He bypassed the electronic sensors with a small jammer, slipping through the iron fence like a phantom. The first guard didn't even hear the wind change. Dante was behind him in a heartbeat, a gloved hand over his mouth and a surgical strike to the base of the skull. The man went down without a sound. Dante didn't stop to check the pulse. He was already moving toward the next target. This was the breaking of the code. This was the moment where the legend of the ghost was replaced by the reality of the Reaper. One by one, the Moretti guards fell in the darkness, silenced by a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Dante reached the rear terrace of the mansion. Through the French doors, he could see Silvio Moretti sitting in a leather wingback chair, a glass of brandy in his hand and a shotgun leaning against the desk. The old man looked frail, but his eyes were filled with the same predatory hunger that had fueled a generation of violence. Dante didn't wait. He kicked the doors in, the glass shattering in a diamond spray of light. Silvio scrambled for the shotgun, but Dante was across the room before the old man could even chamber a shell. He kicked the weapon away and pinned Silvio to the chair with a forearm across his throat. The ghost, Silvio wheezed, his face turning a mottled purple. I knew you'd come. You touched my daughter, Silvio, Dante whispered, his voice a chilling, hollow sound. You broke the only rule that kept you alive. It was business, Silvio gasped. The commission, they wanted to see if you were still the man we feared. Are you satisfied with the result? Dante asked, his grip tightening. He didn't kill the old man. Not yet. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive. This contains every bank account, every shell company, and every offshore trust the Moretti family owns. I've already initiated the transfers. By sunrise, your family will be bankrupt. Your sons will be hunted by the men they owe. Your legacy is ash. Silvio's eyes widened with a terror that no bullet could induce. You can't do that. The commission won't allow it. The commission is next, Dante said, releasing his grip. He stood over the broken old man, the ghost looking down at the wreckage of an era. I'm done being your phantom, Silvio. From now on, I'm the thing you see in the dark when you realize you've lost everything. Dante walked out of the house as the sirens began to wail in the distance. He didn't run. He walked with a measured, lethal calm back toward the woods. As he reached the SUV, Rocco was waiting, the engine roaring. It's done, Dante. The accounts are cleared. The Morettis are a memory. It's not enough, Dante said, climbing into the back. He looked at his hands, realizing they were finally clean of the business, but stained forever by the war. We have 3 more families to visit before the sun comes up. The SUV surged forward, leaving the burning remains of the Moretti ambition behind. Dante Ricci sat in the back, his eyes closed, finally hearing the silence he had been looking for all his life. It wasn't the silence of the grave, it was the silence of a man who had finally decided to be loud. The Velvet Crown was never intended to be a battlefield. It was a temple of shadow, a curated space of mahogany, silk, and the quiet, expensive sounds of men buying their way out of morality. But as the gray sedan screeched to a halt in the rear alley, the restaurant felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. The neon sign above the entrance flickered, a stuttering, dying heartbeat in the Chicago rain. Dante Ricci stepped out of the car, his movements stiff from the adrenaline crash. He was no longer the pristine figure of the ghost. His white shirt was translucent with rain and stained with the copper-smelling spray of the safehouse siege. His charcoal jacket was torn at the shoulder, and his eyes, usually as cold and reflective as river ice, burned with a feverish, desperate light. Rocco, get them inside. The kitchen entrance, Dante commanded. He didn't look back at the city. He didn't need to. He could hear the sirens, a discordant symphony of law and order that was being directed by the very men who had sent the Russians to kill him. They moved through the industrial kitchen, the stainless steel surfaces reflecting the red and blue strobes from the street. Sarah held Penny tight, the girl's face buried in her mother's neck. The silence of the restaurant was eerie, a physical weight that pressed against their eardrums. Every clink of their boots on the tile sounded like a gunshot. Stay in the dry storage, Dante told Sarah, ushering them toward a reinforced room behind the walk-in freezers. It's windowless and the door is rated for high-velocity impacts. Rocco, you stay with them. If anyone gets past the main floor, you know what to do. Rocco gripped Dante's forearm. Dante, you're one man against a coalition. You don't have the gear for a frontal assault. I'm not doing an assault, Rocco, Dante said, pulling a heavy, old-fashioned brass key from his pocket, the key to the front doors he had locked 10 years ago to keep the world out. I'm hosting a final dinner. He watched them disappear into the storage room. The click of the heavy latch was the most painful sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of separation, the realization that to ensure their future, he had to embrace the very thing Sarah had begged him to leave behind, his capacity for absolute, unmitigated violence. Dante walked into the main dining room. He didn't turn on the lights. He let the city's ambient glow, the street lamps, the distant skyscrapers, the pulsing police lights filter through the frosted windows. He walked to his usual table, the one in the corner where he had sat every Tuesday for a decade. He pulled out the chair and sat down. On the table sat an unopened bottle of 30-year-old scotch and 2 glasses. He poured a finger of the amber liquid, his hands remarkably steady. He wasn't afraid. Fear was a luxury for men who had something left to lose. Dante had already lost his reputation, his empire, and his anonymity. All he had left was the blood in his veins and the 2 lives currently hiding in his kitchen. The front doors of the Velvet Crown didn't burst open this time. They were opened with a key. 4 men walked in. They didn't bring soldiers. They didn't need them. The police had cordoned off the block, and the Russians had been told to stand down. This was a meeting of the high table. Silvio Moretti, his face bruised and bandaged from Dante's visit to Lake Forest, led the way, leaning heavily on his wolf-head cane. Behind him were Volkov, Sloan, and Councilman Sterling. They walked through the shadows of the restaurant, their footsteps echoing on the plush carpet. They stopped 5 feet from Dante's table. "You have a flair for the dramatic, Ricci," Volkov said, his voice echoing in the empty room. "Bringing us back to the place where the ghost was born. Is this supposed to be a sentimental gesture?" "It's an accounting," Dante said, taking a sip of the scotch. The burn in his throat was the only thing that felt real. "You've spent the last 6 hours trying to erase me. You sent 40 men to a safe house where my daughter was sleeping. You used the PD to trap a woman who hasn't seen this side of the city in a decade. You broke the system, Dante." Silvio spat, his voice cracking with rage. "You emptied my accounts. You humiliated the Moretti name. You think you can just walk away from the life and take the spoils with you." "The spoils are gone, Silvio," Dante said calmly. "I told you at the old exchange. The Ricci organization is liquidated. The money is in the hands of the people who will use it to put the 4 of you in a cage for the rest of your lives. I didn't just burn my house down, I salted the earth." Sloan, the Irishman, stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of a pistol tucked into his waistband. "Then why are we here? If the money is gone and the war has started, why bring us to your table?" "Because," Dante said, standing up slowly, "you still think you can win. You think that because you have the police outside and the commission behind you, you can walk out of here and continue the game. You think that if you kill me, you can find Sarah and Penny and use them to rebuild what I took." Dante reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black remote. "This isn't a dead man's switch for a bomb. I'm done with bluffs." He pressed the button. The large television monitors mounted behind the bar flickered to life. They weren't showing news feeds or security cameras. They were showing a live broadcast. Dante's face, recorded only minutes ago in the dry storage room, appeared on the screen. But it wasn't just on these screens. "I've spent 10 years building a digital ghost network," Dante said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Right now, this feed, containing the full ledgers of the commission, the GPS coordinates of your offshore servers, and the recorded transcripts of every meeting held at this table for the last 3 years, is being uploaded to every major news outlet in the country. It's also being sent to the Internal Affairs Division of the Chicago PD and the FBI's Racketeering Task Force." Councilman Sterling went pale. You're committing suicide. You're in those ledgers too, Ricci. You'll spend the rest of your life in a supermax." "I was already dead, Sterling," Dante said, walking toward them. The men who had ruled Chicago like gods scrambled backward, their polished shoes slipping on the carpet. "The ghost died the moment Penny grabbed my sleeve. I don't care about a cell. But you? You care about your legacies. You care about your power. And in approximately 4 minutes, that power will be gone forever. Kill him." Silvio screamed, pointing his cane at Dante. "Kill him now." Sloane pulled his pistol, but the room was suddenly plunged into absolute darkness. Dante had cut the main breaker. The velvet crown became a labyrinth of shadows. Dante didn't need light. He had memorized every inch of this room over 10,000 hours of silent observation. He knew the squeak of the third floorboard by the bar. He knew the blind spot created by the velvet curtains. A shot rang out, the muzzle flashed a blinding strobe of white in the darkness. It missed, the bullet shattering a bottle of expensive wine behind the bar. Dante was a phantom again, but this time, he wasn't hiding. He was hunting. He moved with a brutal, visceral efficiency. He wasn't the surgical instrument of the commission anymore. He was a father protecting his child. He reached Sloane first. He didn't use a gun. He used the heavy crystal Scotch glass from the table. A single, crushing blow to the temple sent the Irishman to the floor. Dante caught the man's pistol before it hit the ground. 2 more shots from Volkov's direction. Dante dropped to a crouch, sliding behind a heavy oak pillar. He fired back once, a calculated shot that took Volkov in the leg, dropping the Russian to his knees. Moretti. Sterling. Dante's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The police are coming. But they aren't coming to help you. They're coming because the broadcast just went live. They're coming to save their own skins by arresting the men who can name them. Sterling panicked. He ran for the front doors, but Dante was already there. He stepped out of the shadows, the blue light from the police sirens outside illuminating his face like a vengeful spirit. He delivered a single, powerful kick to the councilman's chest, sending him sprawling back into the center of the room. Only Silvio Moretti remained standing, trembling, his shotgun raised with shaking hands. You ruined everything," the old man sobbed. "For what? A woman? A brat?" Dante walked toward him, the barrel of Sloane's pistol pointed at the floor. He didn't need it. Silvio was a broken relic of a dying era. "For a life," Dante said. "Something you wouldn't understand." Dante reached out and took the shotgun from Silvio's hands. The old man didn't resist. He collapsed into a chair, the same chair Penny had stood by only a few nights ago. The front doors were kicked open. Not by the mob, but by the tactical units of the Chicago PD. The ghost had timed it perfectly. The broadcast had made it impossible for the corrupt officers to protect their benefactors. They had to play the part of the heroes to avoid being indicted as co-conspirators. Dante stood in the center of the room, his hands raised, the pistol and shotgun lying at his feet. The red and blue lights flooded the velvet crown, washing away the shadows. "Dante Ricci," a voice boomed over a megaphone. "Identify yourself." "I'm the man who just gave you your careers back," Dante shouted. As the officers swarmed the room, pinning the heads of the commission to the floor, Dante didn't look at them. He looked toward the back of the restaurant. The door to the dry storage opened. Rocco stepped out first, followed by Sarah and Penny. The police tensed, their weapons turning toward the new arrivals. "They're with me," Dante roared, his voice commanding even in surrender. "They're civilians. Witnesses. If a single hair on their heads is touched, the rest of the files go public." The officers lowered their weapons. Sarah ran to Dante, pushing past the line of police. She threw her arms around him, her tears soaking into his blood-stained shirt. Penny followed, grabbing his hand and holding on as if she would never let go. "It's over, Sarah," Dante whispered, his voice finally breaking. "The ghost is gone." He was handcuffed, led away in the back of a cruiser while Sarah and Penny were escorted to a separate vehicle. As the car pulled away from the Velvet Crown, Dante looked back one last time. The neon sign had finally gone out. The temple was empty. The blood and rebirth was complete. He was going to prison. He was going to lose his freedom for a long time. But as he watched Sarah and Penny disappear into the safety of the night, Dante Ricci felt a weight lift that he had carried for 10 years. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a phantom. He was a man who had finally paid his debt. And for the first time in his life, he could breathe. The air in the federal courthouse was different from the air in the Velvet Crown. It didn't smell of aged cedar or high-end scotch. It smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the sterile, unyielding scent of justice. For 6 months, Dante Ricci had traded his charcoal silk suits for a rough orange jumpsuit and his empire of shadows for a 6 by 9 foot cell in a maximum security wing. To the world, the trial of the century was a spectacle, the systematic dismantling of the Chicago Commission by the very man who had once been its silent architect. Dante had become the state's most valuable and most dangerous witness. He hadn't just given them names. He had given them the soul of the city's darkness. He had walked the prosecutors through every shell company, every corrupted precinct, and every offshore account. He had done it with a clinical, detached precision that made the veteran attorney shiver. He was still the ghost, but now he was haunting the men who had thought they owned him. But today was not about the commission. Today was about the aftermath. Dante sat at the defense table, his hands folded. He was no longer an orange. For the final sentencing, he had been allowed a suit. It was a simple, dark blue wool, nothing like the bespoke garments of his past. He felt lighter, as if the weight of the city had been stripped away along with his notoriety. The judge, a woman known for her ironclad adherence to the law, looked down at him through her spectacles. "Mr. Ricci, the level of cooperation you have provided to the federal government is unprecedented. Because of your testimony, four major crime syndicates have been effectively decapitated, and over 60 corrupt public officials are currently awaiting trial." She paused, leaning forward. "However, the crimes you committed in the decade prior cannot be ignored. The law does not allow for a complete erasure of the past, regardless of the nobility of the present. Therefore, it is the sentence of this court that you serve 10 years in a federal correctional facility." A murmur ran through the gallery, but Dante didn't flinch. 10 years. To a man who had been dead inside for a decade, 10 years was a small price to pay for a future. However, the judge continued, her voice softening just a fraction, in light of the extreme risk to your life and the safety of your family. "You will be entered into the Federal Witness Protection Program immediately upon the completion of a reduced 3-year term at a secure, undisclosed location. Your remaining 7 years will be served as supervised probation under a new identity." Dante closed his eyes. 3 years. He could do 3 years. He had waited 10 years just to hear Sarah's voice. He could wait 3 more to hold her hand in the sunlight. The transition was a blur of blacked-out transport vans and silent handoffs between federal marshals. Dante was taken to a specialized wing of a facility in the rural hills of Virginia, a place where the residents were all men like him, men who knew too much to be kept in the general population. For the first year, he spoke to no one. He spent his days in the small prison library and his nights staring at a single photograph the marshals had allowed him to keep. It was a Polaroid taken at the safe house before the world fell apart. Sarah and Penny, sitting on a concrete bench, the morning sun just hitting their faces. Penny was laughing, her small hand reaching for the camera. He used that photo as a compass. Every time the old darkness tried to creep back in, the ghost, whispering that he should have just killed them all and fled to South America, he looked at Penny's smile. He realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't building an empire. He was building a man worthy of that laugh. Letters arrived once a month, heavily redacted by the marshals to ensure no location data was leaked. Sarah wrote about the small things. She wrote about Penny's first day of school under her new name. She wrote about the garden they were planting in a place where the air tasted of salt and pine. She didn't write about the fear, though he knew it was there. She wrote about the hope. She asks about the ghost, Sarah wrote in the 2nd year. "But I told her the ghost went away so her father could come home." She's learning to play the piano, Dante. She has your focus. When she hits a wrong note, she doesn't cry. She just starts again until it's perfect. I told her that's a Ricci trait. Dante wept over that letter, his tears blurring the ink. He had given his daughter his shadows, but she was turning them into music. The day of his release was unremarkable. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, and no mahogany-filled rooms. There was only a gate, a dusty road, and a plain silver sedan waiting under a sprawling oak tree. Rocco was leaning against the hood. The enforcer looked different. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, his hair a little grayer, his face a little more relaxed. He looked like a man who had finally put down a heavy burden. "You look like hell, boss," Rocco said, but his eyes were bright with a fierce, loyal warmth. "I'm not the boss anymore, Rocco," Dante said, stepping into the passenger seat. "Just Dante." "Whatever you say, Dante," Rocco grinned, putting the car in gear. "The marshals gave me the coordinates. It's a 6-hour drive. You ready?" "I've been ready for 3 years, Rocco." They drove through the heart of the country, away from the steel and glass of Chicago. They talked about the city, how the power vacuum had been filled not by new monsters, but by a fractured peace. The commission was gone, replaced by smaller, disorganized crews that lacked the ghost's vision. The city was still messy, but it was no longer a machine of absolute, organized cruelty. "And Sylvia?" Dante asked as they crossed the border into the Carolinas. "Died in a prison hospital 6 months ago," Rocco said. "The others are rotting in ADX Florence. They'll never see the sun again." "You did it, Dante. You actually did it." As the sun began to set, the landscape changed. The air grew heavy with the scent of the ocean and the sweet, thick smell of jasmine. They pulled onto a gravel road that wound through a forest of live oaks draped in Spanish moss. At the end of the road stood a small, whitewashed cottage overlooking a quiet sound. Rocco stopped the car. "This is as far as I go. The marshals are watching the perimeter, but they're invisible. You're safe here." Dante stepped out of the car. His heart, which had been a cold, rhythmic stone for a decade, was hammering against his ribs. He walked up the path, his boots crunching on the shells. The front door opened. Sarah stood there. She was wearing a simple yellow sundress, her hair pulled back. She looked older, the lines around her eyes telling the story of the last 3 years, but she had never looked more beautiful. She didn't say a word. She just stepped into his arms, and for the first time since he was a child, Dante Ricci felt the world go quiet. "You're late," she whispered into his chest. "I had some things to settle," he replied, holding her as if she might evaporate into the sea mist. A small figure appeared in the doorway. Penny was 9 now, taller, her face losing its baby fat and gaining the sharp, intelligent angles of her mother. She looked at the man standing on her porch, the man who wasn't wearing a silk suit or covered in blood. She saw the man from the Polaroid. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice tentative. Dante knelt on the gravel, opening his arms. Penny didn't hesitate. She ran to him, the same way she had run through the doors of the Velvet Crown, but this time she wasn't running from a nightmare. She was running toward a home. That evening, the new empire began. It wasn't built on territories or ledgers or the fear of a ghost. It was built on a dinner of grilled fish and fresh vegetables, eaten on a wooden deck as the stars began to poke through the velvet sky. Dante sat at the head of the table. He looked at Sarah, who was laughing at something Penny had said. He looked at his daughter, who was showing him her sketchbook, filled with drawings of the birds and boats of the Sound. He thought about the Velvet Crown. He thought about the men he had broken and the life he had led in the shadows. It felt like a story someone else had told him, a dark fairy tale that had finally ended. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old silver locket. He laid it on the table. "I think we can put this away now," he said. "We don't need to look at the past to remember who we are." Sarah took his hand, her thumb tracing the scars on his knuckles. "What are we going to do tomorrow, Dante?" Dante looked out at the water, where the moon was carving a silver path across the waves. He didn't think about the commission or the feds or the Cinder Protocol. He didn't think about the ghost. "Tomorrow," Dante said, his voice a warm, steady velvet, "I think I'm going to help you with that garden. And then I think Penny is going to teach me how to play the piano." The ghost of Chicago was officially dead. In his place was a man named Dante, a woman named Sarah, and a girl named Penny. They were nobodies in a small town, living a life that didn't matter to the world of power and silk. And as the tide came in, washing away the footprints on the shore, Dante Ricci finally understood the truth he had spent a lifetime running from. The greatest power in the world wasn't the ability to make men fear you. It was the ability to make a child feel safe. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was a benediction.